Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Ms. Marvel. Another great episode. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. I love that, obviously, we got introduced to, like, Kamala's, school life, obviously, how she just her walking down the hall in the first episode, in the contrast to her, like, just feeling herself and kind of flexing a little bit as she's going down the hallway. And I love that she split up that couple being like, right, you guys, that's a great thing about AirPods. You don't have to be like right next to each other. You guys are my favorite couple. I'm rooting for you. But yeah, it's like, oh yeah, the guy like dribbling in front of her, she grabs it and she just, and passes it. It's just like, she's just feeling herself like giving him finger guns and being like, sup. I'm like, I love it. But it turns out Zoe's gotten super popular. I mean, it's like, right, it's pretty cool, like, coming face-to-face with a superhero. In fact, being saved by one. So she's gotten a whole bump in her social media. But then Kamala's like, oh, man, like, what if people found out, if person got saved by a superhero gets that much attention, what about the person who actually became one, who actually, is the superhero? But, Bruno brings up the whole, like, right, there is a whole secret identity element to it. So it's like, yeah, but, millions of followers, and it's like, yeah, the mentality of, like, it's like, it's what social media means, especially to younger people. It's like, and what those numbers mean. It's like, oh, that's a whole thing in itself, but... And Zoe's giving her heroes her name is like, yeah, her name is Nightlight, and she's just trying to keep things like super low key and stuff. And she's like, oh, having a party to celebrate the fragility of life, which like our trio were like, oh, we're not gonna go. And then they saw Cameron, which Kamala was like, oh, he's going to the party. Cool, we're going to the party now. Which, anytime I kept hearing his name, it's Cameron, but it's like, anytime I hear it, I have my youngest niece is named Cameron, so every time I hear that, like, that's all I can hear. I'm sure it's kind of like, almost like the equivalency of, like, Cameron, maybe, like, be a more, like, I guess, Anglo-Saxonization of the name, I guess, would be just Cameron. But, like, yeah, and that name existed before it came into my personal life and like my family, but still, it made me think about that. Every time I hear his name, it just made me think of that. Regardless, tangents and all that aside. But other than that, Bruno and her are doing some training, and I love the very like Spider-Man-esque element of trying to, well, for one, figure out what she's capable of. Because I like, obviously, she's embiggening her arm, like, or at least creating like the light structure around it, and just how dense and heavy it can be. It's like, cool, so super strength isn't part of your wheelhouse. So she's doing some training, and it's like, nope, that's not working out. And so I love that we also find out from Bruno that, oh, her powers aren't from the Bengal themselves. The Bengals just bring forth what's inside of her, because the energy comes from her and not the Bengals. So I'm like, oh, so I guess it's playing a little bit of, I mean, maybe this is me reading too much into it, but I'm like, oh, it kind of feels like they're kind of homaging it a bit to what her powers originally are. Her powers do come from herself. They don't come from a Bengal in the comics because she's an Inhuman, which, I mean, I'm basing this solely on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. That's kind of my main through line to Inhumans. That's my only experience with the Inhumans because I've never really read the comics, so I don't know if it's applicable, but the Terrigen makes you an Inhuman because it's already something in you. The Inhuman is there already in you. It just... And if you, obviously, we've seen with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., if you go through Terrigenesis and you're not, don't have that in you, if you're not someone who's predisposed to being an Inhuman, it will kill you. So maybe this is supposed to be like a little homage to that, saying that the power comes from her. The Bengals are just, I guess, an easy outlet. Anime reference I'll always think of is like Kuwabara, how from Yu Yu Hakusho, how when he first made his like energy swords, he needed the broken hilt, like he needed a broken part of a wooden katana to focus, and then eventually he could just surge the energy without it. So I'm wondering, is that going to be the end result of Kamala's story in this? Will be eventually the Bengals might get broken and maybe she won't have her powers for a while, but then it'll be almost like that thing of, who are you without the Bengals? That power is within you. The Bengals were never your power. They just were an easy outlet for you. They helped bring forth what was always there, and she learned to use her powers without it. So I'm wondering if that's going to be the way they operate. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe she'll keep the Bengals forever. I don't know. Because my thought was, even if she isn't Inhuman now, this does still leave the room open. But I doubt they'll go down that route. But my thought, when the trailer first dropped, I was thinking, like, maybe she eventually could become Inhuman. Just like Spider-Man is just a powered person, but he is a mutant. I think he still falls into the category of a mutant, but the X-Men don't exist. The term mutant doesn't exist in this continuity, so they haven't really dived into that aspect of Peter's story, like, being Man-Spider and stuff like that. So I'm wondering if the same thing would happen to Kamala, where it's like, oh, later on they'll be like, oh, you never knew it, but yeah, this entire time you've actually been an Inhuman. Once again, we got a Inhuman, King of the Inhumans, on Earth 838. So I don't know what that really means for 616, but still. Little by little, practicing on summoning her abilities. I thought that's kind of a cute moment where, like, she seemed like she was going to fall. I'm like, wow, you're really jumping to that already? And it's like, she's like, you're going to have to let me go. And it's like, oh, it's like a couple inches drop. It's like, oh, okay. I love how dramatized they made that. But yeah, the thing I was going to say before, too, is it gave me very Sam Raimi Spider-Man elements. I haven't seen the Amazing Spider-Man movies in forever, at least the first one. I don't think Andrew Garfield's Peter ever had that, where like Tobey's Peter, like, oh, like he kind of crashed and burned, like when he was first like web slinging. This was what that kind of gave me element. So I mean, which is very befitting, because the parallel everyone makes is like, oh, Miss Marvel and Spider-Man, they kind of fit that same parallel of young hero. I mean, some people have been going like, right, like Kamala's kind of like the most, like, is the current generation's Peter Parker. In that regard, or just all Spider, because I know Miles falls into that same, as a Spider person, probably him, Gwen, all the Spider people fall in that same lane. So, but which I think that's probably easily going to make Kamala be like the person I love, because she is probably so much like characterization and stuff like that, who she is, like her plucky attitude and stuff, very much like you can definitely see, like I said, see the parallels to Spider-Man, and Spider-Man's my favorite superhero, so I'm like, oh yeah, I can already tell I'm gonna fall in love with Miss Marvel. So I think that's going to be as a character, so I think that's going to be pretty dope. So but nevertheless, she also, once again, I'm compare and contrast. It's just when she at one point creates one of the, or she calls them hard lights, and she made one, and then she kind of slid on it for a little bit. I was like, it kind of reminds me of Iceman a little bit, how he makes his ice trails like kind of get around and to traverse. So it kind of reminded me of that a little bit, and I was like, oh, that's so neat. I also love the reason why she thought of it, because she's done it accidentally, but it wasn't until she saw Bruno playing a game and she applied that, like, oh, I've know that I can do that, so why don't I apply it and make that my main way of using my power. So she's able to kind of do it successfully, and that's actually pretty dope. I do love everything with her and her mom that they do make up this episode, and it's that complicated thing of like, her mom can seem harsh, but it's like any parent that seems harsh. It's like, no, they just want the best for you, and it's just like, I think it's just that complicated thing of like being from different generations, not always being able to always meet in the middle, not always able to communicate the same way, because the world she grew up in isn't the same world Kamala grew up in, but, because she sees the dangers of the world and maybe Kamala doesn't. It's like, right, I just want to protect you from that. So when she wants to go to the party, her mom's reluctant, but it's like, right, be home, but this time come through the front door. So it's like, right, kind of alleviating some of, like, right, where they were kind of before, some of that bad blood kind of got alleviated. It's like, families, they disagree and there's issues here and there, but going to the party, I felt something was up initially when Zoe said like, oh, Cameron, do you want to come to the party? And he was like, yeah. I was like, oh, he seems like he's a little awkward. I was like, oh, is he playing up like, oh, I'm the cool, handsome guy? Like, is he playing up that role? Is what I was wondering. And later on makes me feel like it is. It's him just playing a role. And so, but at the party, which was super short-lived, the cops busted it up. He drove everyone away, and you could tell just like Bruno was so uneasy just the entire time, just staring back and forth between Cameron and Kamala and just being like, oh. He's like, oh yeah, that Bollywood movie you mentioned? Yeah, I'm super into it too. He's like, yeah, I saw it a couple years ago and thought it was pretty pleasing. And then when they left, he was like, oh, bye, Paul, Miguel, Nakia, Brian. And he's like, he knows my name's not Brian. He knows, I'm like, yeah. You can't tell me he doesn't. That was that was done on purpose. He did that with some spice, because he literally got these are people you just met. You got literally everyone else's name right. You got Miguel and Paul's name, but you got Bruno wrong. It's like, no. You can't tell me that wasn't shade. And Nakia making fun of him was like, oh, Bruno, are you mad? Why is Brian, why is Brian mad? It's like, oh, dude. And but her going home and busting into dance, and I love how much flair this show has. I think it's going to be interesting to see how generally people feel about the show. I've heard the general reactions I'd heard previously before even the first episode aired from critics and stuff was like, generally people were like, oh yeah, they were super digging it. But I'm curious, because it's not your very typical superhero thing, because it is like kind of a slow burn, because it's also like, yeah, let's sprinkle in some superhero stuff, but it's like a teen drama all in its own. That's my wheelhouse. Like, I'm like, yo, I can get behind that. Like, it feels like kind of like a teen comedy movie you would see. So I'm curious, like, how Marvel fans will react to that, because obviously we've gotten that in, obviously, once again, the parallel, we've gotten it at Spider-Man, but this feels like it leans into the teenager aspect to it even more so, because this is a full-blown origin story, whereas Spider-Man wasn't. I mean, once again, now the argument is, well, technically Homecoming, Far From Home, and No Way Home have basically been a origin trilogy of sorts. It's kind of how people kind of like phrase it now with the way No Way Home ended. But regardless, I love that, like, how happy and stuff she was, and she's fantasizing about I love how stylized this show is, and he's going to take her for a driving lesson Monday. Then in class, she's just daydreaming about him. And Bruno finds out the sad news that, not good news, that he's going to this Caltech program, and he's going to be there for 6 months, but that means he's going to miss out on the next semester. And he's like, oh, like, should I, can I think about it? It's like, no. He's like, and Mr. Wilson's like, this is the part of the movie where I say, like, oh, you are a Jedi. I was like, okay, I got that. And then he referenced something else, and I was like, at first I was like, is that the Devil Wears Prada he's referencing? Because I don't think I've seen bits and pieces. I've never seen the entire movie. But then the moment he was like, oh, I'm Meryl Streep in this, I'm like, okay, he's definitely referencing the Devil Wears Prada, because immediately my brain thinks of, well, I think the movie, but my brain also thinks the band too. Like, those are always going to be the first two thoughts, because I think it's based on, I think The Devil Wears Prada is a book. Just like the Band of Mice and Men took their name from the book that has also been adapted into movies, much like I said, I think The Devil Wears Prada was the original book. I'm going on a tangent. This isn't about the bands and stuff. I'm aware of stuff like that, but... So Bruno wants to bring that up to Kamala, but the entire episode he never does. It's still that thing of like, oh, I'm kind of sick of it. She's like, oh, I want to ask you something. He's like, oh, yeah? And she's like, oh, I'm inviting, like, my family want to know if you're coming to this thing. And it's like, oh, he's like, yeah, sure. So it's just like, you could tell like how heartbroken he is, because it seemed like that was the case last episode, but now it's like, oh, even more so that, even more so that he's like super into her. I didn't talk about it. And this is an interesting thing, because we know that with Kamala, with her powers, she apparently can embiggen other parts of her body. So, and like, they're kind of be like, oh, like funny, like shenanigans happened because of it when she could control her powers. And again, we got a tiny hint of that where her nose started glowing, and then like she's in the bathroom and it shifts from her nose to her hand. So I think it's interesting too, everything with Nakia, how that all flows together, because she still hasn't told Nakia everything. It's like, right, who would she have told Bruno if Bruno hadn't seen it firsthand? Who knows? But she's just like, yeah, I feel where you are, I'm always going to be playing catch up, and it's like, you make it seem easy. And she had a really, like, real conversation of, like, yeah, like, some people think I'm too white and other people think I'm too ethnic. And I've always been in this, like, super sucky, uncomfortable in-between. And she's like, I soon realized I don't need to basically listen to other people's opinion. Like, she's like, being who I am, I think it's because looking as fair-skinned, like, her skin being as fair as it is, and, wearing her hijab too. Because she even said, like, yeah, my family won't even look me in the eyes. And it's just like, oh. But it kind of that in-between space, but it's like, no matter what, I'm going to embrace me being me, and I'm not going to, basically apologize for it. So I thought that was kind of a beautiful and sentiment, because I think that can be that lane for anyone that has that situation of just feeling like, oh, like when you feel like you just, you feel like you don't belong for, reasons that are outside of your own. It's just like, oh, because of this, like in her case, it's like, oh, you seem too white, so you can't fully fit in with anyone that is Indian, and then it's like, oh, you can't fit in over here with anyone that's Indian because you're too white. So it's just always that double-edged sword of just, and I just thought that was a beautiful thing, and it's just like how inspiring that. And because Nakia is now running for the board at the mosque, and Kamala, that inspired her to do it. And it's just, I think that's such a beautiful, like, friendship and dynamic that they have, that they push and help keep pushing each other forward, that they are like hand in hand kind of helping each other grow. I think that's a beautiful element to it. But also like the complications of like, yeah, cool. Because I don't think I've ever watched anything that's ever really going into the ins and outs of like a mosque situation, because they went in, they were like washing their face. At first I was like, well, because they're washing their face and their feet, which I think it's like, I think the parts of your body that are the most exposed, which will be your face, your hands, and your feet, because you're not supposed to wear, because I think those are supposed to be like, once again, I'm ignorant, so I don't know if it's supposed to be a thing of like, because I guess it's just kind of cleansing those parts of your body that are kind of exposed to some extent, because at first when she was rubbing her lips, I'm like, oh, is it like taking off makeup or something? But I don't know if they're wearing makeup or not. But I was like, is that what that's supposed to be? But I don't know. But the thing I thought was interesting is like, oh, the section that they, Nakia and Kamala were talking about, it's like, right, our section, the section with the women, is kind of like kind of tethered, and the male section is better, and like there's also the female section has the barrier, but it's like it's about preserving modesty is kind of what that's supposed to represent. So I also thought was so interesting, there was two teenagers, like it was, and a lady had to be like, cut it out with your whole like Snapchatting. They're like, we're not Snapchatting, we're Instagramming. And you're like, oh man, that probably happens like all the time. It's like, ugh. I also haven't stepped foot in anything church related since I was a little kid, so not saying that in a braggadocious way or anything like this. Like, no, it's just like a fact. So it's just like, I don't even know what I'm sure like that's a big issue in like any church, no matter where, no matter what background you're from. And I'm curious if there's going to be anything about that shoe stealer, because apparently that's just a little background thing that I'm sure that's going to be a platform that Nakia kind of like will help deal with. But it's like, oh, there's been a whole bunch of shoes stolen recently. At first I was like, could it be someone stole her shoes because someone actually needed some shoes and they grabbed the first shoes that I thought like maybe like, oh, maybe it was like I don't know. I was reading too much into it thinking like, well, maybe someone just happened to run by and just happened to steal your shoes, and maybe we'll find out there's more to it. But because there's been multiple thefts, it made me go, maybe that's not the case at all. Kamala and Cameron spending time together. And I thought this was kind of a neat little moment too, where what was she saying? It was basically the word for, I think in Urdu, for mother. And she was like, oh, my mom. He's like, no, I know what, I think it was like Amani. He's like, I know what that means. I was like, oh, I think that's such a neat little thing, because it's that when I wouldn't know, I don't know multiple, I know tiny bits here and there in other languages, but I'm not like bilingual. And so she is. And so it's like, right. So like you will flip back and forth. Like you'll be like, oh, kind of like someone will say like Spanglish. Like you'll be speaking in English and just suddenly you'll say maybe one or two things in Spanish and then you'll go back to English. So like that's such a little subtle thing. But the fact is she had to feel the need to go like, oh, I'm my mom. He's like, no, I know. Because I think she's just not used to She doesn't want to assume someone's circumstances, so she doesn't want to just, plus she's probably had to be around people where she's had to go like, oh, I said that, it means my mom. It's like, she had to explain that, and I thought that was such a neat little detail. Just a small thing that was like, oh, that's neat that you did that. I thought that was kind of interesting, I think anyone who is bilingual, maybe, I don't know if English is her first language or not. Maybe it is, and even if it is, she's grown up in a household speaking Urdu, so it's like, of course. Or, is Arabic and Urdu, like, under the same, is Arabic, like, I'm sure, I guess it would just kind of be the same thing as, like, I don't know, because I was wondering if, like, Arabic's, like, the main language, and then, like, Urdu's, like, a subsection of that language, or is it just, like, no, they're just, like, their own sections of, like, language, in that region, or, either way, it doesn't. But I love that she ran into her brother, and he was just kind of like, "Oh, who's this guy you're hanging on?" I was like, "Oh yeah, he's our cousin." Like, wait, our cousin? Is like, yeah, your uncle, yeah, by marriage and stuff like that. It's like, oh, huh. Why don't I feel it? He's like, but then he later on goes like, actually, I think I'm remembering you now, and even gave him a nickname. Because he's like, yeah, I think we called you Cameron. And it's like, yeah. I'm like, I love that he started believing the BS, but I love his fiance immediately saw through. It's like, oh yeah, cousin Cameron. It's like, and looks at Kamala knowing exactly what's what. But at dinner, there was this story because her brother's fiance is trying to learn more about their family, so we learn about the circumstances that they came from. That on her mom's side, her mom's mom, her grandmother Santa was a little girl during the partition. And there was a train, and she had gotten separated, and her father was looking everywhere for her, but it wasn't until the train was just about to leave that she found her way back, claiming that she followed the stars, which immediately you're like, so does it have to do with the Bengals? Were the Bengals the actual star that she was referencing, or was she talking about the literal stars, or was it a combination of the two? But then the question becomes, well, what about Santa's mother, Kamala's great-grandmother? What about her? And she disappeared, and no one knows whatever happened to her. And it's a sore subject for both Kamala's mom and her mom's mom about that subject. And we kind of get, like, Kamala asked her mom about it earlier, because her great-grandmother's name was it Aisha? And it's like, oh, like, how'd you hear that name? It's like, I heard it from Nani, it's like, right. That woman, we had to leave to escape the shame that woman brought upon our family. And you're like, what's that about? Because the Illuminantes, because they're the gossipers, ended up talking about the fact is of someone like, oh, I knew about your great-grandmother. She was this. There's word about her being that she's had secret families, that she cheated, that she killed someone. And now even Kamala doesn't know what to believe because her mother won't talk about it. Because I guess the shame is, like, she left her family, and she probably had good reason, but it's just one of those things that just got lost. It's like, right, during everything that was going on, you abandoned your family. But maybe, well, because we know that, at least Kamala's grandmother said that the bangle belonged to her mother, so maybe, like, her mother went off to be a hero, and she left the bangle with Sana, and it's like that's all she has left to remember her. So maybe she wasn't the superhero, maybe her mother was, and now Kamala's. But then once again, it's like maybe not, because her mom immediately saw the bangle and was kind of upset. It could be that. It could be that she doesn't know about the superpowered angle to it, but it could just be like she knows that belonged to her grandmother, and she's like, I don't want a reminder, because like my mother got that when she was a little girl and it got past me. I didn't even want you to have it because it's junk, because it brings up bad memories of what their family's associated with. So but despite everything, it's like, right, you want me to learn more about who I am, but the moment I try to take an opportunity to, you kind of shut that down. She's like, you can know your stories, just not this one. And just kind of made her stop it. I did think it was kind of a cute thing between her parents, like the whole Bon Jovi thing. It's like, oh, what was the song? It was something with wet or whatever. And then like this, Kamala's brother was like, "That's gross. I don't want to hear anymore. I'm done." I'm like, yeah. Because all they said was like, oh, that song is where we, like, if it wasn't for that song, we wouldn't have met. The way you were phrasing it and the name of the song, man, it's made it more of an innuendo of like, oh, if it wasn't for that song, you might not have been born, you or your sister. It almost made it sound like that, but either way. And I love that his fiance comes in and she's knows exactly what to say about Bon Jovi to kind of get the rest of the family on her side. And I love that Nakia is getting, when they show up at once again, a lot of this is culturally, it goes over my head because I'm not familiar what it is, but this celebration and gathering that they're at, that Kamala, Nakia, and Bruno have to go to the different subgroups and have to like convince them to vote for Nakia. And I love that she goes to her uncle and she's like, "Wow, like, you know, Kamala and me, who's your daughter, and the one who's almost like your daughter, you wouldn't try to crush the dreams of two young women, would you?" And he's just sitting there with food almost like in his mouth, almost like, "What?" I'm like, oh, the dirty politics, shaming you into vote. And he's like, "Yeah, but he's my best friend. I'm supposed to be voting for." She's like, "Yeah, vote for me." And his friend's like, "What are you doing?" And he's just kind of like, "Oh, I just want, what?" He's just, poor guy. Poor guy got the rough end of the deal. I love how he got played like that. That was so good. But later on, there's a situation where a kid is in danger, and it's up to Kamala to step in superhero style. And she's taking her time, and she luckily gets to him in time. And but sadly, it happens twice throughout the episode. She has a vision of someone, which I'm wondering, is that supposed to be her great-grandmother? But because of that, like, the first time it happened, she passed out. Second time, I think it caused her to kind of lose concentration, and the boy fell. Luckily, she was trying to reach out with her arm and missed him both times, and then she, like, has to start throwing out the hard light platforms that soften his fall, and it was like, oh, that's, I mean, you know, this hero game ain't easy. You're going to stumble your first time, you know, very much, you know. I mean, even if we wanted to go MCU-wise, like, you know, we saw Peter stumble, like, yeah, that scene from Civil War when Tony was like, "Oh, yeah, look at this. This is you, right?" And he's slamming into a bus or something. It very much like that. And so, yeah. I mean, I think you can almost think of, like, oh, like the Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane thing of, like, oh, webbing to, like, grab you. But in this case, it's, like, her arms, but it didn't reach. Luckily, she had a backup of the platform she could throw out. But then she has to run because she feels like, I screwed up. Like, this is supposed to be my big hero moment, and I failed. And then drones like show up, because then, like, was it the DDoC or something like that? Whatever government agency that they belong to that's looking into this ends up tracking her down and trying to stop her. Luckily, because Cameron showed up, she was able to get away. But the moment his mom was introduced, and she's like, "Oh, I've been wanting to meet you, Kamala," and you're like, because the moment he kind of referenced his mom and the fact he's moving around, I'm like, because there's a bit of a love story here, it's going to be the tragic love story that his mom is a villain, isn't it? Because I felt like that's the angle they were going for, and the fact that she immediately knows about Kamala, which means he knew about Kamala as well. So it's kind of like, oh, you got close to me on purpose, didn't you? So it kind of frames that in a very negative light, I think. But I get the feeling like, maybe I'm completely wrong, but I'm wondering, are they going to set her up to be kind of an antagonist? That it's like, oh, you and Cameron, it's like you kind of are into each other, but it's like, you know, you're both on different sides of this whole thing. Maybe not. We'll see. But that's what my immediate thought was when he brought up his mom and everything. I'm like, well, because we recently, you know, obviously back in Hawkeye, Kate Bishop's mom being a villain, that I was like, oh, we're doing a similar thing here, maybe not. But I did skip over Zoe getting interrogated, and I love that guy being like, "Hey, wait, you're Zoe Zimmer?" And she's like, "Wait, you know?" He's like, "Yeah, we're all offended. I mean, because of your video about the popcorn." She's like, "Oh yeah." He's like, "Yeah, that's why we do this in the break room." It's like, "Yeah, you also went to Avengers Con." It's like, "Yeah." And he was like, "Oh yeah, was it your sister?" And she's like, "What? No, that." It's like, "Oh, was she white with red hair?" And it's like, "What? No, she wasn't white with red hair." And it's like, "Oh, so you do know what she looked like? Oh, like, you know, so what did she look like? Was she Was she this? Was she Middle Eastern? Was she South Asian?" And then they start talking about all the different places they're gonna have to look. I'd assume that like they were, because obviously there's the interrogation mirror that they're probably just looking to see what Zoe's like, because she didn't really get a good look at Kamala obviously, but she kind of felt bad because now it's like, oh man, this hero's gonna be in trouble because of me. So I guess they just because they needed to know where they needed to look, and they were keeping an eye on all these different places, including Mosque. So that's why they were able to track her down later in the episode. But interesting setup and more interesting developments with just getting, once again, more time of Kamala, getting to know her circumstances, getting little tidbits here and there about her family circumstances. But I think now we're going to start ramping stuff up, but being like, all right, so Cameron and his mom, why were they looking for Kamala? Like, what's this all about? Once again, the bangle isn't the power; it comes from within her. But I guess it's like maybe it could be like a, because I think being an Inhuman is like being a mutant, where I think that's hereditary. At least I think being a mutant's hereditary. I think, but I think being an Inhuman, an Inhuman being one as well. I think so. Yes, it's definitely hereditary. Yes. Once again, I'm basing that on Agents of Shields and Inhumans, the show, and I'm sure that still plays very true to the comics in that regard. But whatever the case may be, I'm very, very excited to see where the next episode ends up taking us going forward with all of this. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.